poor young woman let a strange man and his son stay for one night, unaware he's a millionaire CEO. A young woman in a remote Montana cabin opens her door to a stranger and his sick son during a brutal snowstorm, unaware that he's a wealthy CEO with a hidden past. What begins as a cautious act of kindness unfolds into a life-changing journey of trust, hope, and unexpected love. Welcome to Tales from the Heart. Hello, beautiful souls. Welcome to Tales from the Heart, your home for stories that stir the soul and end us of the power of kindness, resilience, and human connection. If you love tales that warm your heart and inspire hope, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and join our community as we share stories that remind us how one small choice can change lives forever. Now let's dive into today's story, a tale of a snowbound night, a brave young woman, and a stranger who carried more than just secrets. The wind howled like a pack of wolves, tearing through the pines that surrounded Clara Thompson's small cabin in the Montana wilderness. It was late February, and a blizzard had swept into the Bitterroot Valley, blanketing the world in white. The power had flickered out hours ago, leaving only the crackling fire in the stone hearth to keep the cold at bay. Clara sat cross-legged on a faded rug, her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug of chamomile tea, her only companion the faint glow of the flames. At 26, she was used to solitude, but tonight felt different. The storm outside was relentless, and the isolation of her cabin, miles from the nearest town of Darby, felt heavier than usual. Clara had inherited the cabin from her grandmother, a tough-as-nails woman who'd raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 9. The cabin was a sanctuary, a place where Clara had learned to mend her own heart, piece by piece, after years of loss and betrayal. She'd moved here 3 years ago, leaving behind a life in Missoula that had crumbled under the weight of a bad relationship and a job that drained her soul. The cabin, with its creaky floors and drafty windows, was her fresh start. But tonight, with the storm raging, it felt more like a fortress under siege. She glanced at her phone on the coffee table. No signal, as expected. The old radio in the corner had warned of the storm for days, urging residents to stock up and stay indoors. Clara had prepared, firewood stacked, canned goods lined up in the pantry, a few candles ready in case the power stayed out. But nothing could prepare her for the sharp knock that shattered the silence. Her heart lurched. She set the mug down, her hand instinctively reaching for the iron fire poker, leaning against the hearth. "Who's there?" she called, her voice sharper than she intended. No one came this far up the mountain road, especially not in a storm like this. The nearest neighbor was 10 miles away, and the town was even farther. "Please," came a man's voice, muffled by the wind and the thick oak door. "I need help. My son, he's sick. We just need shelter for the night." Clara's grip tightened on the poker. She crept to the door, her socks silent on the hardwood floor, and peered through the peephole. In the dim glow of her porch light, she saw a man, tall and broad-shouldered, hunched against the storm. Snow clung to his dark coat, and in his arms was a small figure, bundled tightly, shivering. The boy's head was tucked into the man's chest, but she could hear a faint, rasping cough carried by the wind. "I don't open my door to strangers," Clara said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. A year ago, a charming man with kind eyes had sweet-talked his way into her life, only to leave her with a drained bank account and a heart full of distrust. She wasn't about to make that mistake again. "I understand," the man said, his voice low and steady, but laced with desperation. "I wouldn't ask if I had a choice. My son, he's freezing. We just need one night." Clara hesitated, her breath fogging the frosted glass. The boy coughed again, a painful, hacking sound that cut through her defenses. She thought of her grandmother, who'd always said kindness was a risk worth taking, even when it scared you. With a reluctant sigh, she unbolted the door and swung it open. Snow swirled in, biting at her bare ankles. "Get inside," she said gruffly, stepping aside quickly. The man didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, carrying the boy carefully, his boots leaving wet prints on the floor. Clara shut the door behind them and slid the bolt back into place. The wind's howl dulled to a low moan, but the tension in the room was palpable. "Sit by the fire," she ordered, pointing to the hearth. "Don't touch anything else." The man nodded, his face half hidden by the shadow of his hood. He knelt by the couch, gently setting the boy down. The child was small, maybe 6 or 7, his face pale and flushed with fever. His coughs were softer now, but each one seemed to rattle his thin frame. The man unzipped his own jacket and draped it over the boy, tucking it around him like a makeshift blanket. Clara watched, still clutching the fire poker, her back pressed against the wall. "Your name?" she demanded. "James," he said, not looking up as he brushed snow from the boy's hair. "This is Noah. He's 6. He's got a bad cough, probably the flu." "You think?" Clara snapped, her tone sharp with skepticism. "Walking a kid through a blizzard like this? That's reckless." James's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't argue. "We had nowhere else to go," he said quietly, his voice heavy with something unspoken. "The car broke down a mile back. I was trying to get him to my mother's place in Hamilton, but the roads closed behind us." Clara studied him in the firelight. He didn't look dangerous, but he didn't look entirely honest either. His clothes were soaked but well made. A wool coat, sturdy boots, a scarf that looked expensive despite the snow clinging to it. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and his eyes, when they met hers, were a deep brown, tired but steady. There was something he wasn't saying, but the boy's cough pulled her focus back. "I've got towels and some canned soup," she said, turning toward the kitchen. "That's all you're getting." "Thank you," James said, his voice soft but sincere. He took the towels she handed him and began drying Noah's hair with careful, practiced hands. Clara stood across the room, arms crossed, watching every move. The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the walls, and the storm outside seemed to grow louder, as if protesting their fragile truce. She thought back to the last time she'd let someone into her life. Mark had been charming, a drifter who'd shown up in Missoula with a guitar and a smile that made her feel seen. She'd trusted him, shared her savings, her dreams, only to wake up one morning to an empty apartment and a note that said, "Sorry." The memory still burned, a reminder of why she kept her door locked and her heart guarded. Yet here she was, with 2 strangers in her home. She glanced at Noah, now curled up under his father's jacket, his breathing uneven but calmer. James sat beside him, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on the fire. He didn't try to fill the silence with small talk, and for that, Clara was grateful. "I'm making chicken noodles," she said, breaking the quiet. She moved to the kitchen, pulling a can from the pantry and setting a pot on the old gas stove. The familiar motion steadied her. Boiling water, stirring the soup, the scent of broth filling the air. She poured it into 2 mugs and carried them to the fire, handing one to James and the other to Noah, who stirred awake just enough to take a few sips. "Thank you," James said again, his voice quieter now. Noah mumbled something, his eyes half closed, and James smiled faintly. "He loves chicken noodle, reminds him of his mom." Clara's gaze softened, but she didn't ask. The weight of his words hung in the air, and she could sense the story behind them, one he wasn't ready to share. She sat on the far side of the room, her own mug cooling in her hands, and watched the fire. The silence wasn't hostile, but it wasn't comfortable either, just a fragile balance between caution and necessity. "You don't have to be scared," James said after a while, his voice barely above the crackle of the logs. "I'm not scared," Clara lied, though her grip on the mug betrayed her. "You let 2 strangers into your home," he said, a hint of a smile in his voice. "That's brave." "Or stupid," she shot back, but the corner of her mouth twitched. James chuckled, a low, warm sound that made the room feel less cold. "I'd say the same about myself, but here we are." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. His face was lined with exhaustion, but there was a gentleness in the way he watched Noah, a quiet strength that didn't demand attention. She thought of her grandmother again, who'd always said you could tell a person's heart by how they treated the ones they loved. James's hands, steady and careful as he adjusted Noah's jacket, spoke louder than his words. "One night," she said firmly. "The storm should ease by morning. Then you're gone." James nodded. "One night. That's all we need." Clara's eyes drifted to Noah, now asleep, his small chest rising and falling under the weight of his father's coat. For the first time in a long time, she wondered if opening her door had been a mistake, or the first right thing she'd done in years. The fire in Clara Thompson's Montana cabin burned steadily, its golden light flickering across the walls as the blizzard raged outside. The clock on the mantel, an old brass piece that had belonged to her grandmother, ticked softly, marking the late hour, nearly midnight. Clara sat on the edge of an armchair, her hands still wrapped around the now cold mug of chamomile tea, her eyes darting between the fire and the two strangers who had disrupted her solitude. James sat on the floor beside the couch, his back against the armrest, one hand resting protectively on his son Noah's shoulder. The boy was asleep, his breathing still raspy but slower, wrapped in his father's coat and a faded throw blanket Clara had pulled from a trunk. The silence in the room was heavy, punctuated only by the crackle of the logs and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. Clara's mind churned, her instincts torn between caution and the faint pull of compassion. She didn't trust James, not fully. His story about a broken-down car and a sick child made sense, but there was something in his eyes, a guarded depth that hinted at more than he was letting on. Yet Noah's fevered coughs and small, trembling frame had cracked her defenses, reminding her of a time when she'd been the one needing help, and no one had answered. "You should get some rest," James said quietly, breaking this silence. His voice was low, careful not to wake Noah. "We'll be fine here." Clara's grip tightened on the mug. "I'm not sleeping with strangers in my house," she said, her tone sharper than she meant. She softened slightly, glancing at Noah. "No offense." "None taken," James replied, his lips curving into a faint smile. "I'd feel the same." He paused, brushing a strand of damp hair from Noah's forehead. "Thank you again, for the soup, the fire, all of it. I know this isn't easy." Clara shrugged, uncomfortable with his gratitude. "It's just soup," she muttered, setting the mug on the coffee table. She stood, crossing her arms, and moved to the window, peering through the frosted glass. The world outside was a blur of white, the porch light barely cutting through the storm. "This keeps up, you might be stuck here longer than one night." James nodded, his expression unreadable. "We'll be out of your hair as soon as the road's clear. I promise." She turned back, studying him. The firelight cast shadows across his face, highlighting the lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. He didn't look like a drifter, not like Mark, the man who'd left her broken a year ago. James' coat, though soaked, was high quality, and his boots were sturdy, the kind you'd find in an REI catalog. Not a thrift store. But it was the way he carried himself, calm, measured, even in a storm that unsettled her. He didn't seem like a man who got stranded by chance. "Why were you out here anyway?" she asked, her voice edged with suspicion. "Nobody drives these roads in a storm like this. The news has been warning about it for days." James hesitated, his gaze dropping to Noah. "I was trying to get him to my mother's place in Hamilton," he said, repeating his earlier explanation. "The car's old, and I didn't expect the roads to close so fast. We got stuck about a mile down the mountain and, well, here we are." Clara frowned. Hamilton was a good 30 miles away, and the mountain roads were treacherous even in clear weather. "You couldn't wait out the storm somewhere else? A motel in Derby, maybe?" James's jaw tightened just for a moment before he relaxed. "I didn't have a lot of options," he said quietly. "It's been a rough few months." She wanted to press him, to dig deeper, but Noah stirred, coughing softly in his sleep. James leaned over, adjusting the blanket, his movements gentle but practiced, like a parent who'd done this 1,000 times. Clara's resolve wavered. Whatever James was hiding, he clearly loved his son. That, at least, felt real. "I've got a spare blanket," she said, changing the subject. She moved toward the hallway, her boots echoing on the hardwood floor. In the linen closet, she paused, her hand hovering over a soft, hand-stitched quilt her grandmother had made. A patchwork of blues and greens, each square a memory of summers spent fishing in the Bitterroot River. She rarely used it, keeping it parfully within Harmon's and question here. Clara's eyes drifted to Noah, now asleep, his small chest rising and falling under the weight of his father's coat. For the first time in a long time, she wondered if opening her door had been a mistake, or the first right thing she'd done in years. Despite to these health cares of four, taking the meagerly OV help, folded neatly to preserve its warmth, its history. With a sigh, she pulled it down and carried it back to the living room. "Here," she said, holding it out to James. "It's warm, cleaner than that coat." James looked up, surprised. He took the quilt, his fingers brushing hers briefly, sending an unexpected jolt through her. "This is beautiful," he said, running a hand over the stitching. "Thank you, Clara." She nodded, stepping back quickly to put distance between them. "Don't mention it," she said, returning to her spot by the window. But as James draped the quilt over Noah, tucking it carefully around the boy's small frame, Clara felt a pang she couldn't name. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was. The fire burned lower now, and Clara lit a pair of stubby candles she'd found in a kitchen drawer, their flames casting a warm glow across the room. She sat back in the armchair, her knees tucked under her, and watched as James settled beside Noah, his own mug of soup untouched on the coffee table. The boy's breathing had steadied, and the cabin felt less like a battlefield, more like a fragile truce. "Noah loves chicken noodle," James said after a long pause, his voice soft, almost nostalgic. "His mom used to make it from scratch. Carrots, celery, the whole deal. I try, but it's never the same." Clara glanced at Noah, her expression softening. "He's a sweet kid," she said, then hesitated. "I'm sorry. About his mom." James nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Thank you. She passed 3 years ago. Cancer. Noah was only 3, but he remembers her soup, her laugh." He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "He's all I've got now." The vulnerability in his voice caught Clara off guard. She wasn't used to men who spoke so openly, especially not strangers. In Derby, most folks kept their feelings close, sharing only over coffee at the diner or after a few beers at the local bar. James's honesty felt like a bridge, one she wasn't sure she wanted to cross. She thought back to a summer evening 6 years ago when she was 20, sitting on the porch of this very cabin with her grandmother. They'd been shelling peas, the snap of the pods a steady rhythm against the hum of crickets. "You'll meet people who carry their pain like a badge," her grandmother had said, her hands never pausing. "But the good ones, Clara, they carry it quiet. Watch for those. They're the ones worth knowing." Was James one of those? Clara didn't know. But as she watched him adjust the quilt over Noah, his hands steady despite the weight of his words, she felt a flicker of recognition. She carried her own pain quietly too, her parents' death, Mark's betrayal, the loneliness of a life rebuilt from scraps. Maybe that's why James's presence unsettled her. He felt like a mirror, reflecting parts of herself she'd rather keep hidden. The memory faded, and Clara realized James was watching her, his eyes curious but not intrusive. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," she said quickly, brushing a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "Just thinking." "About what?" he asked, his tone gentle, like he was offering her a way out if she didn't want to answer. Clara hesitated. She could deflect, change the subject, but something in the firelight, in the quiet of the storm, made her want to be honest. "About why I'm out here," she said. "Most people don't choose to live in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, not unless they're running from something." James tilted his head, waiting. He didn't push, and that made it easier to continue. "My parents died when I was a kid," she said, her voice steady but low. "Car accident. My grandma raised me here, in this cabin. She taught me how to fish, how to chop wood, how to keep going when life knocks you down. After she passed, I tried the city, Missoula, for a while. Got a job at a bookstore, thought I could start over. But," she trailed off, her fingers tracing the armrest of the chair. "But it didn't work out," James finished softly. Clara nodded, her jaw tight. "Met someone, thought he was the real deal. Turned out he was just real good at lying. Took what I had and left me with nothing. So I came back here. Figured the cabin was the only place that never let me down." James was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the fire. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "That's a lot to carry." Clara shrugged, but the weight of his words settled over her. "It's life," she said. "You keep moving." He nodded, and for the first time, she saw something in his expression. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. "Yeah," he said, "you do." The conversation lapsed into silence again, but it was different now, less guarded. Clara glanced at Noah, still asleep, and thought about the future for the first time in a long while. She'd always told herself she didn't need anyone, that the cabin and her quiet life were enough. But tonight, with a sick child and a stranger by her fire, she wondered if she'd been lying to herself. Not about James or Noah, not yet, but about the possibility of something more. A life where she didn't have to carry everything alone. The candles flickered and Clara stood, stretching her stiff limbs. "I'll check the fire," she said, moving to the hearth. She added a log, the sparks flaring briefly, and glanced back at James. He was watching Noah, his expression soft but distant, like he was lost in his own memories. She thought about asking more, about his wife, about why he was really out here, but decided against it. There was time, she told herself. One night, maybe two, depending on the storm. For now, she'd keep her questions close, like the fire poker she'd set within reach. As she settled back into the armchair, James spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't have to let us in," he said. "Most people wouldn't have." Clara met his gaze, the firelight reflecting in her blue eyes. "I'm not most people," she said, and for the first time that night she smiled, a small, tentative curve of her lips that felt like a door cracking open. James smiled back, and in the quiet of the cabin, with the storm raging outside, something shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the fragile beginnings of something neither of them could name. The first light of morning crept through the cabin's frosted windows, casting a pale silver glow over the Montana wilderness. The blizzard hadn't relented. If anything, it had grown fiercer, piling snow against the door and burying the mountain road under a thick, unbroken blanket. Clara Thompson stood on the porch, bundled in her grandmother's old wool coat, her breath fogging in the frigid air. The world outside was silent, save for the low moan of the wind through the pines. The county wouldn't plow these back roads until the storm passed, which meant James and Noah were stuck for at least another day. Inside, the cabin was warm, the fire still burning low from the logs Clara had added before dawn. She'd barely slept, her nerves too raw to let her guard down completely. Every creak of the floorboards had jolted her awake, her hand instinctively reaching for the fire poker she'd kept by the armchair. Now as she stepped back inside, shaking snow from her boots, she found James awake, sitting beside Noah on the couch. The boy was stirring, his cough softer but still present, his cheeks flush with lingering fever. "Morning," James said, his voice quiet but steady. He was folding the quilt Clara had given him, his hands careful, almost reverent, as he smoothed the fabric. "Storm's not letting up, is it?" Clara shook her head, hanging her coat on the hook by the door. "Not yet. Radio says it might clear by tomorrow, but these roads won't be passable until the plows come through." She glanced at Noah, who was blinking sleepily, his small hands clutching the edge of the quilt. "How's he doing?" "Better, I think," James said, brushing a hand over Noah's forehead. "Fever's down a bit. The soup and the warmth helped." Clara nodded, her expression softening. "Good, I'll make some breakfast. Nothing fancy. Oatmeal, maybe some canned fruit." "You don't have to," James started, but Clara cut him off with a raised hand. "You're in my house," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "I'm not letting a kid go hungry, or you, for that matter." James smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips that made Clara's chest tighten. "Fair enough," he said. "Thank you, Clara." She turned toward the kitchen, hiding the faint flush in her cheeks. The familiarity of his gratitude unsettled her, stirring memories of a time when she'd been too quick to trust kind words. As she filled a pot with water and measured out oats, her mind drifted back to a crisp autumn day 3 years ago, when she'd still lived in Missoula, before the cabin became her refuge. The memory was vivid, sharp as the scent of fallen leaves. Clara had been 23, working at a cozy bookstore on Higgins Avenue, surrounded by the hum of espresso machines and the rustle of pages. She'd loved the job, loved the way books could transport her to places she'd never seen, lives she'd never lived. But the pay was barely enough to cover rent, and the loneliness of the city had started to creep in. That's when Mark had walked into the store, his guitar slung over his shoulder, his smile bright as a summer day. He'd lingered by the poetry section, reading aloud from Whitman in a voice that made her heart skip. "You're too kind for this city," he'd said that first day, and Clara had laughed, flattered by his attention. They'd talk for hours, and soon coffee dates turned into late-night walks along the Clark Fork River. He'd told her stories of his travels, hitchhiking through Oregon, busking in Seattle, and she'd shared her dreams of opening a community library in a small town, a place where kids could read and feel safe. Mark had listened, his eyes bright with promises, and for the first time since her grandmother's death, Clara had felt seen. But the promises were hollow. 6 months later, he was gone, along with her savings, money she'd scraped together for her library dream. He'd left a note, scrawled on a torn piece of notebook paper. "I'm sorry, Clara. I'm not the man you thought I was." She'd stood in her empty apartment, the note crumpled in her fist, and vowed never to let anyone in again. The cabin, her grandmother's gift, had been her lifeline, a place to rebuild without the weight of betrayal. The clatter of a spoon against the pot snapped Clara back to the present. She stirred the oatmeal, the scent of cinnamon filling the kitchen. Noah's soft cough echoed from the living room, and she glanced over to see James helping him sit up, offering a sip of water from a glass. The boy's eyes were brighter today, though still heavy with exhaustion. Clara's heart tugged, a mix of protectiveness and unease. She didn't want to care, not about Noah, not about James. But it was hard to ignore the way the boy's small hand clung to his father's sleeve. She carried 3 bowls of oatmeal to the living room, setting them on the coffee table alongside a can of peaches she'd opened. "Eat," she said simply, handing a spoon to Noah. The boy took it with a shy smile, murmuring a quiet, "Thank you, Miss Clara." "Just Clara," she said, her voice softer than she intended. She sat across from them, her own bowl untouched, watching as Noah took small bites, his appetite tentative but growing. James ate slowly, his eyes on his son, but Clara caught him glancing at her now and then, his expression unreadable. "You're good with him," James said after a while, nodding toward Noah. "You ever think about having kids?" Clara's spoon paused midair. The question was innocent, but it hit a nerve, stirring dreams she'd buried long ago. "Not really," she said, her tone clipped. "Kids need stability, and I've got enough trouble keeping my own life together." James nodded, accepting her answer without pushing. "Fair enough. Noah's my whole world, but it's not easy. Especially on nights like last night." Clara glanced at Noah, who was now focused on a peach slice, his small fingers sticky with juice. "He's lucky to have you," she said, surprising herself with the words. "Not every dad would carry their kid through a blizzard." James's smile was faint, tinged with something she couldn't place. Guilt, maybe, or regret. "I try," he said, "but I'm not always sure I'm enough." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard again. She wanted to ask more, to unravel the story behind his tired eyes, but the weight of her own past held her back. Instead, she stood, gathering the empty bowls. "I've got some chores to do," she said. "Firewood's low, and there's a leak by the back door that needs patching." "I can help," James offered, standing. "I'm handy with an axe, and I've fixed a leak or two in my time." Clara hesitated, her instinct to keep him at arm's length, warring with the practical need for help. The cabin was old, and maintaining it alone was a constant battle. "Fine," she said finally, "but don't think this makes us friends." James chuckled, a low, warm sound that made the room feel less empty. "Noted," he said, following her to the back door. Outside, the storm was a wall of white, but the porch offered some shelter. Clara handed James her grandfather's old axe, its handle worn smooth from years of use. He swung it with surprising precision, splitting logs with clean, powerful strokes. Clara watched from the doorway, her arms crossed against the cold, impressed despite herself. Most city folks she'd met couldn't handle a tool like that, but James moved like someone who'd grown up with hard work, not just desk jobs in boardrooms. Inside, she set Noah up with a faded picture book she'd found in a trunk, The Little Engine That Could, one of her childhood favorites. The boy's eyes lit up as he traced the illustrations, and Clara felt a pang of nostalgia. She'd spent countless evenings reading with her grandmother, the cabin filled with stories of courage and hope. Now, watching Noah turn the pages, she wondered what kind of future he'd have, what kind of man his father was when the storm wasn't forcing his hand. As James carried an armful of firewood inside, Clara noticed a small, intricate watch on his wrist, half hidden under his sleeve. It was sleek, expensive-looking, not the kind of thing you'd expect on a man stranded in a blizzard. Her suspicion flared again. but she pushed it down, focusing instead on the leak by the back door. James knelt beside her, examining the warped wood with a practiced eye. "Got any sealant?" he asked. "Or some caulk? I can patch now. Keep the draft out." Clara nodded, retrieving a tube of caulk from the shed. As they worked together, their movements fell into an unexpected rhythm. Clara holding the flashlight, James applying the sealant with steady hands. The task was small, but it felt like a bridge, a tentative step toward trust. By afternoon, Noah's fever had eased further, and Clara brewed a pot of ginger tea, adding a drizzle of honey from a local apiary. She sat beside the boy, holding the cup as he sipped, her touch gentle but cautious. "You're gonna be okay, kid," she said, smoothing his hair. Noah smiled, his eyes bright with something like trust, and Clara's heart ached. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed this. Connection, care, the simple act of being there for someone. James watched from the kitchen, his expression unreadable but soft. Clara caught his gaze and looked away, her cheeks warming. She didn't want to like him, didn't want to feel the pull of his quiet strength, but it was there, undeniable, like the fire that kept the cabin warm. As the day wore on, they settled into a fragile rhythm. Clara telling Noah stories about the Montana mountains, James fixing a loose hinge on the bedroom door, the three of them sharing a simple lunch of biscuits and more soup. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the cabin felt like a small world of its own, a place where trust was being built, one careful moment at a time. Clara thought about the future again, not just hers, but Noah's, James's. She imagined a life where she didn't have to guard her heart so fiercely, where the cabin wasn't just a refuge, but a home filled with laughter, with people who stayed. The thought scared her, but it also sparked something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The second day of the blizzard wore on, and the Montana cabin felt both smaller and warmer as Clara Thompson navigated the uneasy rhythm of sharing her space with James and his son, Noah. The storm outside showed no signs of slowing, the snow piling higher against the windows, sealing them in a cocoon of flickering firelight and quiet tension. Clara stood at the kitchen counter, kneading dough for a batch of cornbread, her hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to cook in this very room under her grandmother's watchful eye. The scent of butter and cornmeal filled the air, mingling with the faint, piney aroma of the fire, a reminder of countless winters spent in this cabin. Noah sat at the small dining table, his small frame wrapped in the quilt Clara had given him, a pencil in his hand as he scribbled in a worn notebook James had pulled from his coat pocket. The boy's cough was softer now, but his cheeks still held a faint flush, and Clara kept a close eye on him, her maternal instincts stirring despite her best efforts to keep them at bay. James was in the living room, tinkering with a loose coat hook by the front door, his movements steady and precise, as if he'd fixed 100 small things in his life. Clara watched him out of the corner of her eye, her suspicion tempered by curiosity. He didn't move like a man who'd stumbled into her life by accident. "You don't have to do that," she said, breaking the quiet as she shaped the dough into a cast-iron skillet. "The hook's been wobbly for years. I've learned to live with it." James glanced over, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I don't mind," he said, tightening a screw with a pocket knife he'd produced from somewhere in his coat. "Keeps my hands busy, and it's the least I can do." Clara nodded, brushing flour from her hands. "Suit yourself," she said, but there was no edge in her voice. She was starting to see James as less of a threat and more of a puzzle, one she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. His clothes, his watch, the way he carried himself, it all hinted at a life beyond the story he'd told her. A broken-down car and a sick kid didn't explain the expensive wool scarf now drying by the fire, or the sleek phone she'd glimpsed in his pocket, its screen lighting up briefly before he'd silenced it with a quick, almost guilty motion. She turned back to the cornbread, sliding the skillet into the oven. As she closed the door, a memory surfaced, sharp and bittersweet, pulling her back to a winter evening 4 years ago, when her dreams had still felt within reach. It was late December, and Clara had been 22, sitting in the Missoula Public Library surrounded by stacks of books on community organizing and nonprofit management. She'd been volunteering there, helping with the children's reading program, her heart set on her dream of opening a rural library in Derby. She'd imagined a cozy space filled with books, a place where kids like Noah could escape into stories, where families could gather for story hours or job workshops. Her grandmother had left her a small inheritance, not enough to fund the dream outright, but enough to start planning. Clara had spent hours sketching floor plans, researching grants, even meeting with a local architect who'd offered to draw up blueprints for free. One evening, after a long shift at the bookstore, she'd sat with her friend Sarah, a fellow volunteer, at a coffee shop downtown. The air smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon, and Christmas lights twinkled outside the window. "You're really doing this, aren't you?" Sarah had said, her eyes bright with admiration. "A library in Derby. It's going to change lives, Clara." "I hope so," Clara had replied, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "I want it to be a place where people feel safe, you know? Like my grandma's cabin was for me. Somewhere you can go when the world feels too heavy." Sarah had smiled, squeezing her hand. "You've got her heart. She'd be proud." But then, Mark had entered her life, and the dream had unraveled. He'd promised to help, spinning tales of investors he knew, grants he could secure. Clara had believed him, shared her plans, her savings. When he disappeared, he took more than her money. He took her confidence, her belief that she could build something lasting. The library dream had been shelved, and Clara had retreated to the cabin, telling herself it was temporary, a place to heal. But 4 years later, she was still here, patching leaks and chopping firewood, her dreams gathering dust like the books in her trunk. The oven timer dinged, pulling Clara back to the present. She pulled the cornbread out, its golden crust filling the kitchen with warmth. Noah looked up from his notebook, his eyes brightening. "That smells good," he said, his voice small but stronger than yesterday. Clara smiled, cutting a slice and setting it on a plate for him. "It's my grandma's recipe," she said. "Best with a little butter and honey. Want some?" Noah nodded eagerly, and Clara spread a thin layer of honey from a jar she'd bought at the Derby Farmers Market last summer. She handed him the plate, and he took a big bite, his face lighting up. "It's like cake," he said, crumbs falling onto the quilt. James laughed, a low, warm sound that made Clara's chest tighten. "Easy, buddy," he said, brushing crumbs from Noah's lap. "You're going to make a mess of Miss Clara's nice blanket." "Just Clara," she corrected again, her tone softer now. She cut another slice for James, handing it to him with a nod. "You too, eat." He took it, his fingers brushing hers again, and Clara pulled back quickly, busying herself with cleaning the counter. She didn't want to notice the warmth of his touch, the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. She didn't want to feel anything at all. But Noah was making it hard. The boy had finished his cornbread and was back to his notebook, drawing with fierce concentration. Clara leaned over, curious. "What's that?" she asked. Noah held up the page, his eyes shy but proud. It was a sketch of the cabin, snow piling high outside, with a woman, Clara, she realized, with her blonde hair and blue coat, standing in the doorway. A man and a boy stood in the snow, looking toward her. "That's you," Noah said, pointing to the woman. "You let us in." Clara's throat tightened. The drawing was simple, childlike, but it captured something raw. The moment she'd opened the door, the moment she'd chosen kindness over fear. "That's beautiful, Noah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I keep it?" Noah nodded, tearing the page carefully from the notebook. "It's for you," he said, handing it to her. "So you remember us." Clara took the drawing, her fingers trembling slightly. She taped it to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a Montana grizzly bear, a gift from her grandmother. "I won't forget," she said, and she meant it. James watched the exchange, his expression unreadable but soft. "He's got a big heart," he said quietly. "Gets it from his mom." Clara nodded, her eyes still on the drawing. "She must have been special," she said, then hesitated. "What was her name?" "Emma," James said, his voice catching slightly. "She was everything. Made the best cornbread too, though I think yours might give her a run for her money." Clara smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips. "High praise," she said, but her mind was racing. Emma. The name felt like a piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't enough to explain the watch, the phone, the quiet confidence that didn't match his story of desperation. As the afternoon faded into evening, the cabin settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural. James chopped more firewood, his swing steady and sure, while Clara taught Noah how to play Go Fish with a deck of cards she'd found in a drawer. The boys' laughter filled the room, bright and unguarded, and Clara found herself laughing too, her walls cracking just a little more. But then, as she was clearing the table after a simple dinner of cornbread and leftover soup, she noticed James step outside to the porch, his phone in hand. The storm had eased just enough for a weak signal, and he spoke in hushed tones, his back to the door. Clara couldn't hear the words, but the urgency in his posture set her on edge. When he returned, his face was carefully neutral, but he slipped the phone into his pocket a little too quickly. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "Yeah," James said, avoiding her gaze. "Just checking on my mom, making sure she's okay in Hamilton." Clara nodded, but doubt gnawed at her. The phone was sleek, expensive, not the kind you'd expect from a man who couldn't afford a working car. And the call, why the secrecy? She thought of Mark again, his smooth lies, and her stomach twisted. But then Noah coughed, and James was at his side in an instant, offering water, his touch gentle and sure. Whatever James was hiding, his love for Noah was real. That night, as the fire burned low, Clara sat by the window, staring out at the snow. She thought about her library dream, about the kids she'd wanted to help, the communities she'd wanted to build. She'd given up on it after Mark, convinced she wasn't strong enough, smart enough, to make it real. But watching Noah sleep, his small hand clutching the edge of the quilt, she wondered if she'd been wrong. Maybe strength wasn't about never failing. It was about opening the door, even when you were scared. James sat across from her, his eyes on the fire. "You're thinking again," he said, his voice soft but teasing. Clara smiled faintly. "Hazard of living alone," she said. "Too much quiet." "Want to share?" he asked, his tone open, not pushing. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Maybe tomorrow," she said, "if you're still here." James nodded, accepting her answer. "We'll be here," he said, and for the first time, Clara didn't mind the thought. By the third morning, the blizzard that had trapped Clara Thompson, James, and Noah in her Montana cabin began to relent. The wind no longer howled with its former fury, and the snow fell in soft, lazy flakes, revealing glimpses of the pine trees that stood like sentinels around the property. Clara stood at the kitchen window, a mug of instant coffee warming her hands, and watched the world slowly emerge from its white cocoon. The county plows would likely reach the mountain road by evening, she thought, which meant James and Noah would soon be gone. The realization stirred a mix of relief and something sharper, something she wasn't ready to name. Inside, the cabin was alive with small sounds, the crackle of the fire, Noah's soft giggles as he played with a set of wooden blocks Clara had found in a dusty box under her bed, and the rhythmic creak of James's footsteps as he moved through the living room, tidying up as if he'd lived there for years. Clara glanced over, her eyes narrowing slightly. He was too comfortable, too at ease in her space, and it made her uneasy. Yet there was something disarming about the way he folded the quilt with care, the way he checked Noah's forehead every few minutes, his touch gentle but deliberate. "Roads might be clear by tonight," Clara said, breaking the quiet. She set her mug on the counter and crossed her arms. "You'll be able to get to Hamilton soon." James nodded, pausing to stack a few logs by the hearth. "That's good news," he said, though his tone held a hint of reluctance. "We've imposed long enough." Clara shrugged, brushing off the sentiment. "It's fine. You didn't exactly plan to get stranded." Noah looked up from his blocks, his eyes bright despite the lingering flush in his cheeks. "Can we come back, Clara?" he asked, his voice small but hopeful. "This place is cool, like a fort." Clara's heart tugged, and she forced a smile. "Maybe, kid," she said, ruffling his hair. "If you're ever back in these parts." James watched the exchange, his expression soft but guarded. "He's taken to you," he said quietly. "Not every stranger gets a drawing and a smile." Clara glanced at the fridge, where Noah's drawing of the cabin in their first night still hung, secured by the grizzly bear magnet. "He's easy to like," she said, then turned back to the counter, busying herself with washing dishes. She didn't want to admit how much Noah's trust meant to her, how it chipped away at the walls she'd built so carefully. As she scrubbed a pot, her mind drifted back to a moment in Missoula 2 years ago, when she'd been at her lowest, still reeling from Mark's betrayal. The memory was raw, like a wound that hadn't fully healed. Clara had been 24, living in a cramped studio apartment above a laundromat, the hum of dryers a constant backdrop to her sleepless nights. She'd quit her bookstore job after Mark left, too ashamed to face her coworkers, who'd warned her about him. Her savings were gone, her library dreams shattered, and the weight of failure pressed down on her like a physical thing. She'd spent days wandering the city, her boots scuffing the sidewalks of downtown Missoula, passing coffee shops and bookstores that felt like relics of a life she'd lost. One afternoon, she'd ended up at a community center, drawn by a flyer for a free art workshop for kids. She'd slipped into the back, watching as a group of children, some as young as Noah, painted with messy, joyful abandon. A volunteer, an older woman with kind eyes, had noticed her lingering and handed her a paintbrush. "Join us," she'd said. "You look like you could use a little color." Clara had hesitated, but something in the woman's voice, warm, unguarded, had pulled her in. She'd sat with a girl named Mia, who'd painted a bright yellow sun with a smiley face. "This is my mom," Mia had said proudly, pointing to the sun. "She's always warm, even when it's cold outside." Clara had smiled, her throat tight, and helped Mia add clouds to her painting, their edges soft and hopeful. That day had planted a seed, a reminder of why she'd wanted to build a library in the first place, not just for books, but for moments like that, where kids could feel safe, seen, valued. She'd left the workshop with a spark of determination, promising herself she'd find a way to rebuild. But the spark had faded under the weight of bills, dead-end jobs, and the loneliness of a city that no longer felt like home. She'd returned to the cabin soon after, telling herself it was temporary, but deep down she'd been running. From failure, from trust, from herself. The clink of a block hitting the floor snapped Clara back to the present. Noah was stacking his wooden blocks into a wobbly tower, his tongue poking out in concentration. James sat beside him, offering a steady hand when the tower threatened to topple. "You're getting good at this," James said, his voice warm with pride. Noah grinned, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, shiny object. "Look, Clara," he said, holding it up. It was a keychain, sleek and metallic, with a logo Clara didn't recognize, a stylized R entwined with a crescent moon. "Dad says it's from his work. It's special." Clara's eyes flicked to James, who stiffened slightly, his smile faltering. "Noah, put that away," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "You don't want to lose it." Noah pouted, but tucked the keychain back into his pocket. Clara's suspicion flared. The keychain wasn't cheap. It looked custom, expensive, the kind of thing a company might give to a high-ranking employee, not a man stranded in a blizzard with a broken-down car. She filed the detail away, her mind racing with questions she wasn't ready to ask. "Nice keychain," she said casually, drying her hands on a dish towel. "What kind of work do you do, James?" He hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long. "Consulting," he said, his voice even. "Freelance, mostly, helps pay the bills." Clara nodded, but her instincts told her there was more to the story. Consulting didn't explain the watch, the phone, the keychain, or the way he'd silenced that call on the porch yesterday, his voice low and urgent. She wanted to press him, but Noah's laughter interrupted, the boy proudly showing off his now finished tower. "Look, Clara," he said. "It's our cabin." Clara smiled, crouching beside him. "It's perfect," she said, adjusting a block to steady the structure. "You're an architect in the making." Noah beamed and James watched, his expression softening. "You're good with him," he said again, echoing his words from yesterday. "You'd make a great teacher." Clara straightened, brushing off the compliment. "I'm no teacher," she said, "just good at keeping kids entertained." But James's words lingered, stirring the same dream she'd buried in Missoula. She imagined a library filled with kids like Noah, their laughter echoing off the walls, their drawings pinned to a bulletin board. She imagined a place where she could be more than a survivor, where she could build something that mattered. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure if she'd fall or fly. The afternoon passed in a blur of small tasks. James repaired a creaky floorboard in the hallway, using tools from Clara's shed, while Clara taught Noah how to make paper snowflakes, their shapes littering the dining table like a miniature blizzard. The boy's energy was returning, his cough less frequent, and Clara found herself relaxing, her guard lowering despite her better judgment. As evening fell, the storm finally began to clear, the sky turning a soft gray. Clara stood on the porch, watching the last flakes drift down, her thoughts tangled. She didn't want James and Noah to leave, not yet, but she didn't know how to ask them to stay or why she even wanted to. The cabin felt fuller with them here, less like a refuge and more like a home. James joined her on the porch, his hands in his pockets, his breath visible in the cold air. "Looks like we might be able to leave soon," he said, his voice quiet. Clara nodded, her chest tight. "Yeah, roads should be clear by morning." He looked at her, his eyes searching. "You've done more for us than you know," he said. "I won't forget it." Clara met his gaze, her heart pounding. "Just doing what anyone would," she said, but the words felt hollow. She wasn't just anyone, and this wasn't just any night. Something had shifted, and as the snow settled around them, Clara wondered if she was ready to open her door a little wider, not just to James and Noah, but to the possibility of something more. The sun rose weakly over the Bitterroot Valley, its pale light filtering through the thinning clouds and casting long shadows across the snow-drenched landscape. Clara Thompson stood on the porch of her Montana cabin, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, the chill of the morning seeping through her wool sweater. The blizzard had finally passed, leaving behind a world transformed. Trees bowed under the weight of snow, the mountain road barely visible but passable, according to the crackling radio report she'd heard at dawn. The county plows were making their way up the valley, and by midday James and Noah would be able to leave. Inside, the cabin was quiet, the fire reduced to glowing embers in the hearth. Noah was awake, sitting cross-legged on the couch, munching on a piece of leftover cornbread, and flipping through the little engine that could, the picture book Clara had given him. James was packing their few belongings, a scarf, a notebook, the quilt Clara had insisted they keep for the journey. The sight of him folding it with care, his hands steady but slow, stirred a pang in Clara's chest. She didn't want them to go, not yet. But the thought of asking them to stay felt impossible, like reaching for a dream she wasn't sure she deserved. "Roads should be clear soon," Clara called through the open door, her voice steadier than she felt. "You'll make it to Hamilton by afternoon." James looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers across the room. "That's good," he said, though his tone held a trace of something else, regret maybe, or hesitation. "We've taken up enough of your time." Clara shrugged, stepping back inside and shutting the door against the cold. "It's been interesting," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Not every day I get house guests in a blizzard." Noah glanced up from his book, his small face brightening. "Can we come back, Clara?" he asked again, his voice hopeful. "Maybe for summer? Dad says the river's good for fishing." Clara's heart softened, and she crouched beside him, ruffling his hair. "The Bitterroot's great for fishing," she said. "My grandma used to take me to catch trout. If you're ever back this way, I'll show you her favorite spot." Noah grinned, his eyes sparkling, and Clara felt a warmth she hadn't expected. She glanced at James, who was watching them with a quiet intensity, his hands still on the quilt. "He'd love that," he said softly. "We both would." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Clara stood, brushing her hands on her jeans, and moved to the kitchen to hide the flush in her cheeks. She busied herself with making breakfast, scrambled eggs from the last of her stash, toast from a loaf she'd baked 2 days ago. As she worked, her mind drifted back to a moment 5 years ago, when James's life had been a different kind of storm. The memory wasn't Clara's, but James's, though she couldn't know it yet. 5 years ago, James Rivera had been 32, standing in a sleek Seattle office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Puget Sound. He'd been at the peak of his career, the CEO of Riverstone Holdings, a tech conglomerate he'd built from a garage startup into a billion-dollar empire. The office was a hive of activity, phones ringing, analysts pitching ideas, the hum of ambition in every corner. But James's focus was on the small framed photo on his desk. Emma, his wife, laughing with 2-year-old Noah in her arms, their faces lit by a Montana sunset. Emma had been his anchor, the one who'd believed in him when he was just a coder with big dreams. They'd met in college at Montana State, bonded over late-night coffee and a shared love of fly fishing. She'd supported him through the lean years, celebrating every milestone: the first investor, the first patent, the IPO that made them millionaires overnight. But then came the diagnosis: pancreatic cancer, aggressive and unrelenting. James had poured millions into treatments, flown her to specialists in Boston and Zurich, but nothing could stop the inevitable. Emma died 6 months later, leaving James with a grieving toddler and a fortune that felt hollow without her. He'd thrown himself into work, believing it would fill the void. Riverstone grew, acquiring startups, launching initiatives, but the success was a mask. At night, he'd sit in his empty penthouse, Noah asleep in the next room, and wonder what he was building for. Emma had always wanted to return to Montana, to raise Noah in the wide-open spaces of her childhood. James had promised her they would, but after her death, he'd stayed in Seattle, tethered to a life he no longer recognized. A year ago, he'd taken a leave of absence, telling his board he needed time with Noah. They traveled to Montana, staying with his mother in Hamilton, trying to rebuild what grief had broken. But the weight of his wealth, his reputation, followed him, and when Noah fell ill during the blizzard, James had been driving an old pickup, not his usual Tesla, to avoid drawing attention. The car's failure had been an accident, but their arrival at Clara's cabin felt like something else, something he couldn't yet name. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Clara stood, brushing her hands on her jeans, and moved to the kitchen to hide the flush in her cheeks. She busied herself with making breakfast, scrambled eggs from the last of her stash, toast from a loaf she'd baked 2 days ago. As she worked, her mind drifted back to a moment 5 years ago, when James's life had been a different kind of storm. The memory wasn't Clara's, but James's, though she couldn't know it yet. 5 years ago, James Rivera had been 32, standing in a sleek Seattle office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Puget Sound. He'd been at the peak of his career, the CEO of Riverstone Holdings, a tech conglomerate he'd built from a garage startup into a billion-dollar empire. The office was a hive of activity, phones ringing, analysts pitching ideas, the hum of ambition in every corner. But James's focus was on the small framed photo on his desk: Emma, his wife, laughing with 2-year-old Noah in her arms, their faces lit by a Montana sunset. Emma had been his anchor, the one who'd believed in him when he was just a coder with big dreams. They'd met in college at Montana State, bonded over late-night coffee and a shared love of fly fishing. She'd supported him through the lean years, celebrating every milestone: the first investor, the first patent, the IPO that made them millionaires overnight. But then came the diagnosis: pancreatic cancer, aggressive and unrelenting. James had poured millions into treatments, flown her to specialists in Boston and Zurich, but nothing could stop the inevitable. Emma died 6 months later, leaving James with a grieving toddler and a fortune that felt hollow without her. He'd thrown himself into work, believing it would fill the void. Riverstone grew, acquiring startups, launching initiatives, but the success was a mask. At night, he'd sit in his empty penthouse, Noah asleep in the next room, and wonder what he was building for. Emma had always wanted to return to Montana, to raise Noah in the wide-open spaces of her childhood. James had promised her they would, but after her death, he'd stayed in Seattle, tethered to a life he no longer recognized. A year ago, he'd taken a leave of absence, telling his board he needed time with Noah. They traveled to Montana, staying with his mother in Hamilton, trying to rebuild what grief had broken. But the weight of his wealth, his reputation, followed him. And when Noah fell ill during the blizzard, James had been driving an old pickup, not his usual Tesla, to avoid drawing attention. The car's failure had been an accident, but their arrival at Clara's cabin felt like something else, something he couldn't yet name. The sizzle of eggs pulled Clara back to the present. She plated the breakfast, setting 3 places at the dining table. Noah bounded over, his energy returning, and James followed, his movements slower, as if reluctant to let the morning pass. They ate in companionable silence, the clink of forks and Noah's chatter about fishing filling the space. As Clara cleared the plates, Noah tugged at her sleeve. "Clara, want to see something cool?" he asked, his eyes wide. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the keychain again, the sleek, metallic one with the R and crescent moon logo. "Dad says it's from his big office. He's got a whole building with his name on it." Clara's breath caught, her eyes flicking to James. He froze, his hand halfway to his coffee mug, his expression tightening. "Noah," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Put that away, buddy. We don't need to bore Clara with work stuff." Noah pouted but obeyed, slipping the keychain back into his pocket. Clara's mind raced. A building with his name on it? That wasn't freelance consulting. That was something bigger, corporate, powerful, wealthy. Her suspicions surged, mingling with a strange disappointment. She'd started to trust James, to see him as more than a stranger, but this felt like a crack in the story he'd told her. "Big office, huh?" she said, her tone light but probing as she stacked the plates in the sink. "Must be some consulting gig." James met her gaze, his eyes guarded but steady. "It's complicated," he said. "I've stepped back from a lot of it, trying to focus on what matters." He nodded toward Noah, who was back on the couch, humming to himself. Clara nodded, but the doubt lingered. She thought of Mark, his smooth lies about investors and dreams, and her stomach twisted. But James wasn't Mark. He was here, caring for his son, fixing her cabin, leaving her cornbread and gratitude. Still, the keychain, the phone, the watch, they didn't add up. The morning passed in a blur of final preparations. James helped Clara shovel the porch, their breaths visible in the crisp air. Noah played nearby, tossing snowballs at a tree, his laughter echoing through the valley. Clara watched them, her heart heavy with mixed emotions. She wanted them to stay, to keep filling her cabin with their presence, but she also wanted her solitude back, her walls intact. As they sat for a final cup of coffee, James broke the silence. "Clara, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low, hesitant, "about why we're here." Her pulse quickened, but before he could continue, the rumble of a plow echoed down the road, its yellow lights flashing through the trees. The moment was gone, and James stood, his jaw tight. "That's our cue," he said. "We should get ready." Clara nodded, her throat tight. She helped them gather their things, her hands lingering on the quilt as she handed it to Noah. "Keep it," she said. "It's cold out." James nodded, accepting her answer. "We'll be here," he said, and for the first time Clara didn't mind the thought. By the third morning, the blizzard that had trapped Clara Thompson, James, and Noah in her Montana cabin began to relent. The wind no longer howled with its former fury, and the snow fell in soft, lazy flakes, revealing glimpses of the pine trees that stood like sentinels around the property. Clara stood at the kitchen window, a mug of instant coffee warming her hands, and watched the world slowly emerge from its white cocoon. The county plows would likely reach the mountain road by evening, she thought, which meant James and Noah would soon be gone. The realization stirred a mix of relief and something sharper, something she wasn't ready to name. Inside, the cabin was alive with small sounds: the crackle of the fire, Noah's soft giggles as he played with a set of wooden blocks Clara had found in a dusty box under her bed, and the rhythmic creak of James's footsteps as he moved through the living room, tidying up as if he'd lived there for years. Clara glanced over, her eyes narrowing slightly. He was too comfortable, too at ease in her space, and it made her uneasy. Yet there was something disarming about the way he folded the quilt with care, the way he checked Noah's forehead every few minutes, his touch gentle but deliberate. "Roads might be clear by tonight," Clara said, breaking the quiet. She set her mug on the counter and crossed her arms. "You'll be able to get to Hamilton soon." James nodded, pausing to stack a few logs by the hearth. "That's good news," he said, though his tone held a hint of reluctance. "We've imposed long enough." Clara shrugged, brushing off the sentiment. "It's fine. You didn't exactly plan to get stranded." Noah looked up from his blocks, his eyes bright despite the lingering flush in his cheeks. "Can we come back, Clara?" he asked, his voice small but hopeful. "This place is cool, like a fort." Clara's heart tugged, and she forced a smile. "Maybe, kid," she said, ruffling his hair. "If you're ever back in these parts." James watched the exchange, his expression soft but guarded. "He's taken to you," he said quietly. "Not every stranger gets a drawing and a smile." Clara glanced at the fridge, where Noah's drawing of the cabin and their first night still hung, secured by the grizzly bear magnet. "He's easy to like," she said, then turned back to the counter, busying herself with washing dishes. She didn't want to admit how much Noah's trust meant to her, how it chipped away at the walls she'd built so carefully. As she scrubbed a pot, her mind drifted back to a moment in Missoula 2 years ago, when she'd been at her lowest, still reeling from Mark's betrayal. Clara's shift at the Darby Diner was in an hour, and she forced herself to focus, pulling on her work boots and a flannel jacket. The diner was her lifeline, one of two part-time jobs that kept her afloat, alongside her work at the town library. As she locked the cabin door, she glanced at Noah's drawing on the fridge, the grizzly bear magnet holding it in place. The image of her opening the door to James and Noah in the snow felt like a memory from another life, one where she'd been brave, not just surviving. The drive to town was slow, the road still slick from the storm. Darby was a small, tight-knit community, its main street lined with a general store, a hardware shop, and the diner where Clara worked. The Bitterroot Valley was waking up, locals trudging through the snow to clear driveways or grab coffee at the diner. As Clara parked her beat-up Subaru outside, she caught sight of her reflection in the window, blonde hair pulled into a messy bun, blue eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She looked like someone carrying too much, and for the first time in a while she wondered if anyone else could see it. Inside, the diner smelled of bacon and maple syrup, the jukebox playing a soft country tune. Clara tied on her apron, nodding to her co-worker Jenny, a chatty woman in her 50s who'd known Clara's grandmother. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Jenny said, sliding a tray of coffee pots onto the counter. "Storm keep you up?" "Something like that," Clara replied, forcing a smile. She didn't mention James or Noah, didn't know how to explain the way their brief presence had unraveled her carefully guarded world. Instead, she poured coffee, took orders, and smiled at regulars, her mind half on the black card, waiting back home. During a lull, she slipped into the back, pulling the note from her pocket. She read it again, tracing James's handwriting, the words both simple and heavy. "You've given us more than you know." What did that mean? And why leave a card that screamed wealth? A card she couldn't bring herself to use. Her thoughts flashed to Mark, the man who'd stolen her savings and her trust, and her stomach twisted. But James wasn't Mark. He'd fixed her cabin, cared for his son, left without taking anything but her quilt and her peace of mind. The memory came unbidden, sharp as the winter air. 3 years ago, Clara had arrived at the cabin, her Subaru packed with what little she'd salvaged from her Missoula apartment. She'd been 23, broken by Mark's betrayal, her dreams of a community library reduced to a folder of crumpled notes and a bank account with $12.47. The cabin had been her grandmother's, a place of childhood summers, filled with fishing trips and campfire stories. But it was also a relic, its roof leaking, its walls drafty. Clara had stood in the doorway that first night, a duffel bag at her feet, and felt the weight of starting over. Her grandmother's voice had echoed in her mind. "This place is yours, Clara. It's got strong bones. Build something with it." She'd spent that first week cleaning, scrubbing years of dust from the floors, patching leaks with duct tape and determination. She'd found her grandmother's old recipe box, filled with cards for cornbread, trout stew, and huckleberry pie, each one a reminder of the woman who'd taught her resilience. Clara had cried that night, not from sadness, but from the quiet strength of knowing she could survive this. The library dream hadn't died, not entirely. She'd taken a job at the Darby Library, cataloging books and reading to kids during story hour, telling herself it was a step toward rebuilding. But the bills piled up, and the diner job became a necessity, not a choice. Every paycheck went to firewood, groceries, or fixing the cabin's endless ailments. The dream of a community space, books, workshops, a place for kids like Noah, felt further away with each passing month. But it lingered, a spark she couldn't extinguish. Back at the diner, the lunch rush kept Clara moving, but her thoughts stayed on the card. By the end of her shift, she'd made a decision. She drove to the only bank in town, a small brick building with a faded sign that read, Bitterroot Valley Credit Union. The parking lot was half empty, the snow still piled high from the storm. Clara clutched the black card in her coat pocket, her breath fogging as she approached the counter. "I found this," she said, sliding the card across to the teller, a young man named Ethan who'd gone to high school with her. "I need to know who it belongs to." Ethan's eyebrows lifted as he examined the card, its sleek surface catching the fluorescent light. He typed a few numbers into his computer, then frowned. "This is a private account," he said, his voice cautious. "No name attached, at least not publicly. High-tier status, though. Whoever owns this has serious money." Clara's heart thudded. "Can you tell me anything else? Like a company, maybe?" Ethan shook his head, sliding the card back. "Not without authorization, but I'd be careful with it. People who carry cards like that don't just lose them." Clara nodded, tucking the card away. "Thanks," she said, her mind racing. Serious money, a building with his name on it. James's story about freelance consulting felt thinner than ever. But the memory of his gentleness with Noah, his gratitude for her kindness, kept her from dismissing him entirely. The days blurred into a routine of work and solitude. Clara split her time between the diner and the library, her evenings spent in the cabin, staring at the black card and Noah's drawing. She'd wake in the night, half expecting a knock at the door, but the only sound was the wind through the pines. The loneliness she'd once embraced now felt like a weight, pressing against her chest. One evening, as she sat by the fire with a book, her thoughts turned to the future. She imagined her library again, not just a dream, but a reality. A log building with wide windows, shelves of books, a corner for kids with beanbags and picture books. She saw herself there, reading to kids like Noah, helping parents find job resources, building a community that felt like family. The vision was so vivid, it hurt, a reminder of how far she was from making it real. But James's note, his card, Noah's drawing, they stirred something in her, a belief that maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought. Then on a crisp Wednesday morning, a letter arrived, slipped under her door in a cream-colored envelope, her name written in elegant script. Clara's hands trembled as she opened it, her eyes scanning the words. "Dear Miss Clara Thompson, we are pleased to invite you to a private interview for the newly established community outreach program within Riverstone Holdings. We are seeking individuals of rare character, strong values, and demonstrated compassion. Your name was personally recommended. Please arrive at our Missoula office at the time below. Travel arrangements have been made on your behalf. Sincerely, James R., Chief Executive Officer, Riverstone Holdings." Clara's breath caught. James. Riverstone Holdings. The keychain's logo flashed in her mind, the R with the crescent moon. He wasn't just a consultant, he was a CEO, a man with wealth and power, and he'd found her again. She sat on the couch, the letter pressed to her chest, her mind a whirlwind of questions. Why her? Why now? And what did this mean for the fragile hope she'd started to feel? Clara Thompson gripped the steering wheel of her old Subaru, the hum of the engine a steady companion as she drove through the winding roads of the Bitterroot Valley toward Missoula. The late February sky was a pale blue, the snow-dusted pines giving way to the urban sprawl of the city as she crossed the Clark Fork River. The letter from James, James R., Chief Executive Officer, Riverstone Holdings, lay folded on the passenger seat, its cream-colored paper worn from her repeated readings. The words still felt surreal, an invitation to an interview, a recommendation from James himself, a chance at something she couldn't yet define. Missoula was a 40-minute drive from Darby, but it felt like another world. The city buzzed with life, coffee shops with chalkboard menus, bookstores with displays of local authors, students from the University of Montana weaving through downtown. Clara hadn't been back since she'd left 3 years ago, fleeing the wreckage of her life after Mark's betrayal. Now, as she navigated the familiar streets, her stomach churned with a mix of anticipation and dread. What did James want? Why her? And why did the thought of seeing him again make her heart race? She parked outside a sleek glass building on Higgins Avenue, its modern facade a stark contrast to the rustic charm of Darby. The sign above the entrance read Riverstone Holdings, the logo, a stylized R, entwined with a crescent moon, matching the keychain Noah had shown her. Clara adjusted her scarf, a knitted gift from her grandmother, and smoothed her navy dress, the only one she owned that felt professional enough. Her work boots, still speckled with mud from the cabin, looked out of place against the polished marble lobby, but she squared her shoulders and stepped inside. The receptionist, a young woman with a warm smile, greeted her. "Miss Thompson, we've been expecting you. Please take the elevator to the 32nd floor. Mr. Rivera will meet you there." Clara's breath hitched. Mr. Rivera. The name confirmed what she'd suspected. James wasn't just a stranded father with a sick son. He was someone with power, wealth, a life far removed from her quiet cabin. She stepped into the elevator, her reflection staring back from the mirrored walls, her blue eyes wide with uncertainty. As the numbers ticked upward, her mind drifted to a moment a month ago, when James had made a decision that would bring them here. The memory was James's, not Clara's, though she couldn't know it yet. It was a quiet evening in Hamilton, a week after the blizzard. James sat in his mother's small living room, the glow of a table lamp casting shadows on the walls. Noah was asleep upstairs, his cough finally gone, a stuffed trout Clara had given him tucked under his arm. James held Noah's drawing of the cabin, the one Clara had taped to her fridge, its simple lines capturing a moment that had changed him. He'd returned to Hamilton a different man than the one who'd left Seattle. The weight of his wealth, his title as CEO of Riverstone Holdings, had always felt like a chain, keeping him tethered to a life of boardrooms and expectations, far from the simplicity Emma had loved. But Clara's cabin, her kindness, had reminded him of what mattered. She'd opened her door to strangers, shared her food, her warmth, without asking for anything in return. It was the kind of strength Emma had possessed, the kind James had lost somewhere along the way. That night, as his mother brewed tea in the kitchen, James had pulled out his laptop and started drafting a proposal. Riverstone Holdings had the resources to fund community initiatives, but its outreach programs had always been corporate, detached. Clara's actions had inspired something new, a program focused on rural communities, offering libraries, job training, childcare. He'd named it the Open Door Initiative, a tribute to the night that had changed him. And he wanted Clara to lead it, not just because of her kindness, but because she understood what it meant to give without expecting anything back. Sincerely, James R., Chief Executive Officer, Riverstone Holdings. He'd hesitated before writing the letter, his pen hovering over the paper. Would she come? Would she trust him? A man who'd kept his identity hidden? He'd left the black card as a gesture, a way to show her he wasn't just a drifter, but now he wondered if it had been a mistake. Clara wasn't someone who cared about money, she'd made that clear, but he had to try, had to give her a chance to build something bigger than her cabin's walls. So he'd written the letter, sealed it, and sent it to Darby, hoping she'd open one more door. The elevator dinged, pulling Clara back to the present. The doors slid open, revealing a sleek hallway with glass walls and polished wood floors. A woman in a tailored blazer greeted her, leading her to a spacious office with a view of the Clark Fork River winding through Missoula. And there he was, James, standing by the window, his charcoal suit a far cry from the soaked coat he'd worn in her cabin. He turned, his dark eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, time seemed to pause. "Clara," he said, his voice warm, familiar, but tinged with something new, confidence maybe, or relief. "You came." "You invited me," she replied, her tone soft but steady. She clutched the letter in her hand, her heart pounding. "I wasn't sure I would." "I'm glad you did," he said, gesturing to a pair of armchairs by a low table. "Please, sit." Clara lowered herself into the chair, her fingers gripping the armrests. The office was elegant, modern, with a shelf of awards and a framed photo of Noah grinning by a river. James sat across from her, his hands folded, his expression open but careful. He reached for a folder on the table and slid it toward her. Inside was Noah's drawing, the cabin, the snow, Clara opening the door. "You kept it," she whispered, her voice catching. "Noah insisted," James said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "He called you our angel that night. I wanted to keep a piece of what it meant." Clara's throat tightened, her eyes fixed on the drawing. "I didn't do anything special," she said, shaking her head. "Just open the door." "You did more than that," James said, his voice steady. "You gave us shelter, warmth, hope. You reminded me what strength looks like. Not power, not control, but kindness. That's why I asked you here." Clara looked up, her blue eyes searching his. "Who are you, James?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Really?" He hesitated, then leaned forward, his hands clasped. "My name is James Rivera. I'm the CEO of Riverstone Holdings. I didn't tell you that night because I didn't want it to change how you saw me. I've spent years building this company, but that night, I was just a father trying to keep my son safe." Clara's mind raced, the pieces falling into place. The keychain, the watch, the black card. "So, the consulting story," she trailed off, her tone sharp but not accusing, "was true, in a way," James said, his eyes steady. "I've stepped back from day-to-day operations to focus on Noah, but I couldn't tell you everything. Not then. I needed to know you were real, not someone swayed by a title or money." Clara's jaw tightened, her old wounds flaring. "I'm not swayed by money," she said, her voice low. "I never was." "I know," James said quickly. "That's why I'm here, offering you this." He pushed another folder toward her, this one thicker, filled with papers. "The Open Door Initiative. It's a new program, rural libraries, job training, childcare. I want you to lead it." Clara blinked, her hands frozen on the folder. "Me? Why?" "Because you've lived it," James said. "You know what it means to give without expecting anything back. You understand the people we're trying to help, small-town folks, families like Noah and me. You're the kind of leader this needs." Clara opened the folder, her eyes scanning the proposal. Plans for a library in Darby, resources for single parents, community spaces. It was her dream laid out in black and white, but it felt too big, too sudden. "I'm not a leader," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm just me." James leaned forward, his eyes intense but kind. "You're enough," he said. "You opened your door to us. That's where this started. I believe in you, Clara. I hope you'll believe in yourself." She looked at him, her heart pounding. The man who'd sat by her fire, who'd fixed her cabin, was now offering her a chance to rebuild her dream. But it wasn't just about the job. It was about trust, about opening her heart again, and that scared her more than anything. Clara Thompson sat in her Montana cabin, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, the cream-colored letter from James Rivera resting on the dining table beside Noah's drawing of their snowbound night. The black card he'd left, a sleek, mysterious symbol of his wealth, remained untouched in a drawer, but its presence lingered in her mind, a reminder of the choice she faced. The Open Door Initiative, a program to build rural libraries, job training centers, and child care facilities, was more than a job offer. It was her dream, resurrected in a folder of plans and promises. Yet accepting it meant trusting James, a man who'd hidden his identity, and trusting herself, a woman who'd spent years guarding her heart. The drive back from Missoula had been a blur, the Clark Fork River glinting under the late February sun as Clara wrestled with her decision. James's words, "You're enough," echoed in her mind, challenging the doubts that had kept her anchored to the cabin's solitude. She'd spent the evening rereading the proposal, her fingers tracing the plans for a library in Darby, a space she'd once envisioned in late-night sketches. By morning, she'd made her choice. She'd called the number on the letter, her voice steady as she told the Riverstone Holdings assistant, "I'm in." Now, 2 weeks later, Clara stood in a small office in Missoula, a converted warehouse space buzzing with the energy of the Open Door Initiative's early days. The walls were lined with blueprints and maps, marking rural communities across Montana, Darby, Hamilton, Stevensville, where the program would take root. Clara's desk was cluttered with notes, grant applications, and a photo of Noah she'd taped to her monitor, his grin a reminder of why she'd said yes. She wore a simple blazer over jeans, her work boots still muddy from a site visit in Darby, her blonde hair pulled into a loose braid. She felt out of place among the sleek laptops and polished staff, but James's belief in her gave her courage. Her first task was daunting, designing the pilot library in Darby, a log building with wide windows, shelves of books, and a children's corner with beanbags and murals. She'd spent days meeting with architects, librarians, and community leaders, her vision taking shape in sketches and budgets. Every evening she returned to the cabin, exhausted but alive, the dreams she'd buried after Mark's betrayal now unfolding before her. James was a constant presence, not just as CEO but as a partner in the work. He joined her for site visits, his charcoal suits traded for flannel and jeans, his hands as steady with a hammer as they'd been with Noah's fevered forehead. They debated fiercely, Clara pushing for community input, James emphasizing scalability, but always found common ground, their shared commitment to the program, a bridge between them. He'd leave coffee on her desk each morning, black with 2 sugars and a sprinkle of cinnamon, never mentioning it, and Clara would catch herself smiling, her walls softening with every quiet gesture. Their connection grew in small moments, a shared laugh over a botched blueprint, a late-night email exchange about grant funding, a brush of shoulders as they walked through a snowy field in Derby, envisioning the library's foundation. Clara felt the pull of something deeper, but fear held her back. Trusting James meant risking her heart, and she wasn't sure she was ready. One afternoon, as they reviewed plans in the Missoula office, James handed her a folder labeled Derby Pilot. "This is your vision," he said, his dark eyes warm. "I'm just here to make sure it happens." Clara opened the folder, her breath catching at the detailed sketches, a library with a stone fireplace, a reading nook for kids, a community room for workshops. "This is everything," she whispered. "How did you know?" "You told me," James said simply. "That night in the cabin when you talked about your grandmother, about wanting a place where people feel safe. I listened." Clara's throat tightened, her fingers tracing the sketches. She looked at him, seeing not just the CEO, but the man who'd sat by her fire, who'd carried his son through a blizzard. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, "for believing in me." James smiled, a faint curve of his lips that made her heart race. "Always," he said, and for a moment the office felt as warm as her cabin had that snowy night. The memory came gently, like a breeze through the pines. 6 years ago, Clara had been 20, sitting on the porch of her grandmother's cabin, a notebook in her lap filled with sketches of her dream library. The Bitterroot Valley was alive with summer, crickets humming, the river glinting in the distance, the scent of huckleberries in the air. Her grandmother, a sturdy woman with calloused hands and kind eyes, had been shelling peas beside her, the snap of the pods a steady rhythm. "You've got big dreams, Clara," her grandmother had said, glancing at the sketches. "A library's more than books. It's a heart for a town. You're building a home for people's hopes." Clara had smiled, her pencil tracing the outline of a window. "I want it to feel like this," she said, gesturing to the cabin. "Warm, safe, like you're never alone." Her grandmother had nodded, her hands never pausing. "You'll do it," she said, "but it won't be easy. Dreams like that take grit, and they take trust, in yourself, in others. Don't let fear steal it from you." Clara had carried those words through her years in Missoula, through the betrayal that followed. She'd lost her trust in others, but her grandmother's belief in her had never faded. Now, standing in the Missoula office, the sketches in her hands felt like a promise kept, a dream reborn through the door she'd opened for James and Noah. The weeks passed in a rhythm of work and connection. Clara and James traveled to Derby for community meetings, listening to locals share their hopes, a space for kids to read, job training for single parents, a place to gather after church. Noah joined them sometimes, his energy boundless, his drawings now pinned to the office walls. He'd hug Clara each time, calling her Miss Clara with a grin, and she'd feel a warmth she hadn't known she needed. One evening, after a long day in Derby, Clara and James stayed late in the office, reviewing grant proposals. The city was quiet outside, the Clark Fork River reflecting the streetlights. James leaned back in his chair, his tie loosened, his eyes tired but bright. "You're doing it, Clara," he said. "This library, it's going to change lives." "We're doing it," she corrected, her voice soft. She looked at him, her heart pounding. "I couldn't have done this without you." James's gaze held hers, something unspoken passing between them. "You could have," he said, "but I'm glad you didn't have to." The moment stretched, fragile and full, until Clara looked away, her cheeks warm. She wanted to reach for him, to let herself feel what was growing, but the shadow of her past held her back. Instead, she stood, gathering her papers. "I should head home," she said, her voice unsteady. James nodded, standing too. "I'll walk you out," he said, his tone gentle. They stepped into the cold night, their breaths visible in the air. As they reached her Subaru, James paused, his hands in his pockets. "Clara," he said, his voice low, "I don't want to push, but I'm here when you're ready." She met his gaze, her heart racing. "I know," she whispered. "I just need time." He nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "Take all the time you need," he said. And as she drove away, his words stayed with her, a promise she wasn't sure she could accept. Clara's reflections turned to the future as she drove back to the cabin. She saw the library rising in Darby, its doors open to kids like Noah, parents like James, people like her who needed a second chance. She saw herself there, not just leading, but belonging, part of a community she'd helped build. And she saw James and Noah, not as strangers but as part of her life, if she could find the courage to let them in. The cabin was dark when she arrived, but the fire she lit felt like a beacon. She pulled out Noah's drawing, her fingers tracing the lines of the door she'd opened. For the first time in years, she felt ready to open another, not just for others, but for herself. The spring sun hung low over the Bitterroot Valley, casting a golden glow across the newly built Darby Library, its log walls and wide windows a beacon in the heart of the small Montana town. Clara Thompson stood at the entrance, her hands smoothing the navy dress she'd worn to her first meeting with James Rivera nearly 3 months ago. Today was different, not an interview, but a celebration. The Open Door Initiative's pilot library was opening its doors, a dream Clara had once sketched in a notebook, now made real through months of hard work, community support, and the quiet partnership she'd built with James. The library was alive with activity. Children darted through the children's corner, their laughter echoing off the stone fireplace where beanbags and picture books waited. Locals mingled in the community room, sipping coffee from the Darby Farmers Market and sharing stories of what this space meant to them. A mural on one wall, painted by kids from the town, depicted the Bitterroot River winding through pines, a nod to the valley's heart. Clara's eyes lingered on a framed drawing above the circulation desk, Noah's sketch of her opening the cabin door to him and James in the blizzard, now a symbol of the library's mission, to open doors for all. James stood nearby, his charcoal suit traded for a flannel shirt and jeans, his dark eyes bright as he spoke with a group of donors. Noah, now fully recovered from his illness, ran up to Clara, his grin wide as he hugged her waist. "Miss Clara, look," he said, holding up a library card with his name scrawled in marker. "I can borrow books now." Clara laughed, ruffling his hair. "You're going to need a big backpack for all the books you'll take home," she said, her heart swelling. Noah had become a constant in her life, his visits to the office and site meetings a reminder of why she'd taken this chance. James, too, had become more than a partner in the project. Their connection had grown through late-night planning sessions, shared dreams for the program, and moments of quiet understanding that felt like home. The past months had been a whirlwind. Clara had thrown herself into the Open Door Initiative, leading community meetings, securing grants, and designing the library with a passion she hadn't felt since her days volunteering in Missoula. She'd quit her diner job, keeping only her part-time role at the town library to stay connected to Darby's readers. The cabin remained her sanctuary, but it was no longer a place to hide. It was a home filled with new memories like Noah's drawings pinned to the fridge and James's coffee mugs left on the counter after planning visits. Her relationship with James had deepened slowly, like the spring thaw. They'd clashed over budgets and timelines, their stubbornness sparking debates that always ended in mutual respect. But it was the small moments, his hand brushing hers as they passed blueprints, his quiet, "I'm proud of you," after a successful meeting, that had chipped away at her fear. Clara had spent years guarding her heart after Mark's betrayal, but James's patience, his honesty about his past as Riverstone Holdings CEO, had shown her trust could be rebuilt. One evening, a month ago, they'd stood on the library's unfinished porch, the stars bright above the valley. James had taken her hand, his touch warm and steady. "You've changed my life, Clara," he'd said, his voice low. Not just with this program, but with who you are. I don't want to lose that. Clara had looked at him, her heart racing. I'm scared, she'd admitted, but I don't want to lose you either. He'd smiled, pulling her close, and they'd stood there, the future unwritten, but full of promise. Since then, they'd taken it slow, building something as sturdy as the library's logs, rooted in kindness and hope. The memory came softly, a whisper from James's past. 6 years ago, he'd stood on a Montana riverbank with Emma, his wife, their fly rods casting lines into the Bitterroot River. Noah, just a year old, slept in a carrier against Emma's chest, his tiny breaths a counterpoint to the water's rush. The sun was setting, painting the sky in pinks and golds, and Emma had laughed, her eyes bright with love. This is what I want for him, she'd said, nodding toward Noah. A life where he knows this. Quiet, real, full of heart. Promise me, James, you'll give him that. James had promised, his hand squeezing hers, unaware that cancer would steal her a year later. Her words had haunted him through his rise at Riverstone Holdings, through the empty nights in Seattle. He'd kept Noah close, but the promise had felt out of reach until Clara's cabin, until her kindness reminded him of Emma's heart. That night, as he'd watched Clara tend to Noah, he'd felt Emma's presence, a quiet blessing to open his heart again. Reaching out to Clara with the Open Door initiative had been his way of honoring both women, the one he'd lost and the one he was falling for. The library opening ceremony began with a ribbon cutting, Clara and James standing side by side, Noah holding the oversized scissors with both hands. The crowd cheered as the ribbon fell, and Clara's eyes stung with tears. She gave a short speech, her voice steady despite the emotion in her chest. This library is about opening doors, she said, her gaze finding James and Noah. It's about kindness, community, and second chances. Thank you for making it real. The applause was warm, but it was James's hand on her shoulder, his quiet, "You did it," that meant the most. As the crowd dispersed, Clara led tours, showing off the children's corner, the job resource center, the fireplace where she'd read to kids that morning. Noah trailed her, his library card clutched like a treasure, and James watched, his pride evident in every glance. That evening, as the last guests left and the library quieted, Clara and James stood in the community room, the windows reflecting the soft glow of string lights. Noah was with James's mother in Hamilton, giving them a rare moment alone. James took Clara's hand, his touch familiar now, grounding. "You've built something incredible," he said, his voice low. "Not just this library, but a future. For Darby, for Noah, for us." Clara's heart raced, her blue eyes meeting his. "Us?" she asked, a smile tugging at her lips. James nodded, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a simple silver ring, its band engraved with tiny words. "Thank you for opening the door." He knelt, not in a grand gesture, but with the quiet strength she'd come to love. "Clara," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "you gave me and Noah a home when we had none. You gave me hope when I'd forgotten what it felt like. I don't promise perfection, but I promise to keep the door open. For you, for Noah, for whatever we build together. Will you marry me?" Clara's eyes filled, her breath catching. She thought of her grandmother, of the cabin, of the night she'd opened her door to strangers. She thought of her library dream, now real, and the future she saw with James and Noah, a life of love, not fear. She knelt beside him, her hands cupping his face, and kissed him softly, her answer in the warmth of her touch. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. 1,000 times. "Yes." James slipped the ring onto her finger, his eyes shining, and they held each other. The library's quiet, wrapping around them like a promise kept. Winter returned gently to the Bitterroot Valley, the snow falling like silk over the pines. Clara's cabin, now lovingly restored, stood at the end of a winding road, its creaky door welcoming James and Noah for a weekend. The fireplace glowed, pine and cinnamon in the air, and above the mantel hung Noah's drawing, framed in glass. Clara stood on the porch, her ring catching the light, watching James and Noah build a snowman, their laughter echoing through the valley. Inside, the cabin was full, not just of people, but of love. Noah called it his second home, and Clara's heart swelled each time. They cooked together, played board games, told stories by the fire, the rhythm of their life as natural as the river's flow. Clara's library thrived, a heart for Darby, and the Open Door initiative grew, reaching more towns, changing more lives. As she watched James and Noah, Clara reflected on her journey. Opening her door that stormy night had been a risk, but it had led to this, a family, a purpose, a love she'd never expected. She'd found her strength not in solitude, but in connection, in the courage to trust again. Thank you, beautiful souls, for joining us on Clara, James, and Noah's journey in this heartwarming tale of kindness, trust, and second chances. We hope this story reminded you that the smallest acts, like opening a door, can change lives forever. If Tales from the Heart touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, and share this video with someone who needs a little hope today. Your support keeps our stories alive, and we can't wait to share more tales of love and resilience with you. Until next time, keep your heart open and let kindness lead the way. See you soon.